Guys, let's dive right in with President-elect Donald Trump's federal criminal election interference case being dismissed. Special counsel Jack Smith filed motions yesterday to drop all federal charges against Trump regarding his effort to overturn the 2020 presidential election in the lead up to the January 6th on the Capitol and the case about Trump's mishandling of classified documents. Hours later, U.S. District Judge Tanya Chutkan granted Smith's motion to dismiss the January 6 related indictment. Trump's election victory earlier this month means the Justice Department's longstanding position that a sitting president cannot be charged with a crime will apply to Donald Trump once he takes office on January 20th. Judge Chutkan's ruling leaves open the possibility the charges might be refiled after Trump leaves office, noting Trump's protection from prosecution only lasts as long as his term. As for the classified documents case, special counsel regulations require Jack Smith to file a report to the Attorney General explaining his charging decisions before he steps down. President-elect Trump still faces state charges for election interference in Georgia, but as you know, that case currently is on hold. Trump also awaiting sentencing on 34 felony convictions in New York in his criminal hush money case. But just last week, the judge issued a delay without providing any new sentencing date. All right, let's bring in our reporters, our analysts, NBC News correspondent Vaughn Hilliard, former litigator and MSNBC legal correspondent Lisa Rubin, former U.S. attorney and MSNBC contributor Chuck Rosenberg, and NBC News justice and intelligence correspondent Ken Delaney. And good morning to you all. Great group to sift through a busy morning in the courts. So, Chuck, let me just start with you about Jack Smith basically saying, we're going to put this to the side with regards to the attempt to overturn the 2020 election and also with the classified documents case. Any surprises for you in what you heard yesterday?
Not really, Willie. I think what Smith did was inevitable and necessary. Now, on 3 occasions, the Department of Justice, under President Nixon, under President Clinton, now under President Biden, have more or less weighed the same question, whether a sitting president, in this case, a president-elect, can be prosecuted. And the answer is no, and I think that's correct constitutionally and practically. And so what the Smith team did was move to dismiss the cases without prejudice, meaning at least theoretically they could come back one day, but for now they are gone. And I think it is exactly the right thing for the Smith team to do. Some folks may be disappointed, some folks may be elated, but I think as a constitutional and legal matter, as I said, inevitable, necessary, and appropriate, Willie.
And Ken, it was worth noting that Jack Smith, when he announced this yesterday, did not say, we're not dismissing the case because we don't believe the evidence isn't there. We believe we have a strong case that Donald Trump worked to overturn the 2020 election and to interfere in the outcome. We're just saying that we agree, as Chuck just said, with the Justice Department policy that sitting presidents cannot be prosecuted. So how about for you reporting this from the inside? How did this come to be, and were you surprised by anything you saw yesterday?
Not surprised at all, Willie, because in fact, Jack Smith felt he had no choice but to do this. And it also was a strategic move on his part. No choice because he's a Department of Justice employee. And as soon as Donald Trump was elected, his office asked the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel whether that longstanding policy that presidents can't be indicted or prosecuted would apply to a president-elect before he's inaugurated. And the OLC came back and said, yes, we believe it would apply. And so at that point, Smith felt he had no choice but to seek the dismissal of the case. Now, he could have potentially resigned first or kept the case around and let the Trump Justice Department deal with it, but he then would have lost control of what he would say in concluding this case. And you can imagine a Trump Attorney General filing a document that says, we no longer stand behind this case. We didn't think we could prove it at trial. And to the contrary, as you pointed out, Jack Smith made very clear in this filing that this decision does not speak at all to his view of the evidence of the case, of his chance for conviction. They are standing behind the prosecution. And as you said, he will file a report. Now, there's some question as to whether there could be any new information in that report, given the compressed time frame here, because normally the intelligence agencies have to review, in a case like this, whatever new information is released. They had to review everything that went into the indictments, and there just isn't time for a review like that. So I think we can expect not to learn much new information in the report, but we may see a hearty defense of the prosecution, a challenge to the idea that this was somehow weaponized or politicized, and an explanation of exactly why they brought these cases and why they thought they were important.
It's just extraordinary that this is where we are. We remember those high-profile January 6th House hearings that came ahead of the federal charges there in the election interference case. We remember the FBI search on Mar-a-Lago and the firestorm that created politically. And yet, after 2 years' worth, this all ends, Lisa, with a whimper. This goes away in the most quiet possible way. That Donald Trump and his legal team played the waiting game. They tried to delay. It worked. They pushed it past the election. He wins. These cases now are abandoned. Give us your analysis of what happened yesterday and whether or not you think there is a chance, even a slim one, that they could be revived down the road once Trump leaves office.
Well, first, in terms of what happened yesterday, I fully agree with Chuck that this was both inevitable and necessary. The department's internal policy did not allow for them to do anything else other than to dismiss these cases. But in terms of the contingencies, both of these cases have sort of like revival opportunities there only if the Trump Justice Department sort of leaves them alone. And what I mean by that is, first of all, Jack Smith said in his filing to Judge Chutkan yesterday that there's an open question about whether the statute of limitations against former President Trump, it's a 5-year statute of limitations, could be tolled or paused while he takes office. That doesn't mean, for example, that the Trump Justice Department, through their own Office of Legal Counsel, couldn't issue a new opinion saying tolling is itself unconstitutional. And that's a possibility that might happen. With respect to the Florida case, that dismissal is, of course, only against President Trump, not against the 2 other defendants. But were I the Trump Justice Department, I'd be thinking about pardons for Walt Nauta and Carlos de Oliveira, the other 2 defendants. The last thing that they want, and particularly if you talk to people in Trump world, John, they are much more angry about the classified documents case and some of the things that went on there than they are even about the federal election interference case. I think that we can expect them to pardon Carlos de Oliveira and Walt Nauta because they don't want some of what happened there to be rehashed, particularly given the allegations of obstruction of justice against the former president as they manifest in the charges against those 2 individuals.
Yeah, it's a great point about what the Trump Justice Department may do. And, these 2 cases obviously very much in doubt. The Georgia case is future deeply murky. And even though there's a conviction in New York, it's hard to say whether there'll ever be a sentencing there. That case might be tossed aside as well. So, Vaughn, as so many Democrats have said to me in recent days, he got away with it. He got away with all of it. That there were 4 criminal cases against Donald Trump. They appear to be all on the verge of going away. So let's talk about the politics of this now. This is now Donald Trump who has emerged victorious electorally and from the legal system. He's going to be emboldened, and he might be seeking vengeance.
When the next generations after us look back at this moment in history books, this is going to be a twofold answer as to what happened. Number one, what was amounted to an effective delay in the DOJ really pressing forward, particularly on the election interference case. Jack Smith didn't get his hands on this case until November of 2022 after the work of the January 6th Select Committee. It was not only until then that you started to see Vice President Mike Pence be called in and go before the grand jury and actually talk with the prosecutors and answer questions. 2 years, almost 2 years after the January 6th attack. Then the second part of that, though, is ultimately who made the decision to bring these cases to a close. And who was that? It was the voters. It was Americans that made the decision that the system of justice was not going to see the end in these particular cases. In large part, 1 year after January 6th, I was out in Arizona. It was Donald Trump's return to the campaign trail, January of 2022 out in Arizona. And at that point in time, he was running what amounted to a propaganda campaign that the election was in fact stolen from him. It was FBI instigators that were involved in the Capitol attack, not his people. And when you traveled around the country the last 3+ years, you heard from a significant number of Americans that believed it or questioned its truth. And ultimately, in November of 2024, what happened? Americans said, despite watching what unfolded on January 6, 2021, and despite Donald Trump trying to hold on to power, that they wanted to return him to the White House and effectively end these cases against him.
And, Sam, how many times did we hear people say over the course of the last couple of years with Donald Trump running to get back to the White House, part of the reason, or perhaps all of the reason he's doing this is to become president and keep himself out of jail? Well, it appears he's done that for now. We'll see if they really do revive these cases down the road when an 82, 84-year-old former president is sitting there. But this is mission accomplished as far as his team is concerned, and they effectively said as much yesterday.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine them reviving these cases 4 years from now, assuming Trump is no longer president 4 years from now. So that I do think he wriggled out of this one, and it does get to the basic idea, which is that Trump has this incredible Teflon about him, and you just can't deny it at this point. And it does raise questions too, including one I think I pushed to Chuck here, which is, did Merrick Garland fumble the ball? That is, obviously, look, there's been an incredible number of convictions and sentencing involving people who rioted at the Capitol. That's undeniable. Whether those continue to stand once Trump gets back into office and potentially issues a blanket pardon, we'll see. But it is also undeniable that they took a while to go after Trump himself with respect to the January 6th case. And if you talk to senior Democrats now, including those in the White House, there is frustration over the Attorney General's decision to what they think is slow walk this. And so, hindsight's 20/20, but should Garland have moved faster on this case to give Smith more time?
Maybe, Sam. I mean, I understand the criticism. I was a federal prosecutor for a long time, at least in my world, which seemed a little bit more normal than the one I currently live in. Precision was more important than speed. So could he have moved faster? Should he have moved faster? Perhaps. But at the end of the day, you want to get this stuff right. Now, I've also been a critic just generally of the special counsel regulations, regardless of who the attorney general is and regardless of who they appoint. I've always thought that the mechanism was flawed. And so, maybe there's a lot of blame to go around here, but at the end of the day, the Department of Justice did appoint a special counsel. Jack Smith and his team, I think, were diligent and thoughtful in their work. And if you prize precision over speed, then it's hard to say that they were moving too slowly. Circumstances overtook them. If you're looking for someone to blame, I guess Merrick Garland is someone you can blame, but that's not how I think about it, Sam.
Lisa, it is important to underline the fact, as I said earlier, that Jack Smith says, we believe we have a strong case in both of these cases. We have the evidence. We have the witnesses. We're not pursuing these because of that. We're doing it because of this regulation. So I guess it does raise the question about statute of limitations. Do you really see a scenario where this case, first of all, the election interference case, but also the classified document case, where they do come back someday down the road?
I don't foresee that circumstance, Willie. I think they were smart to leave it open for themselves and leave that contingency. But for the reasons that I identified earlier, first of all, I don't know that there will be a political will to reopen these cases with respect to somebody who is then well into his 80s. But even beyond that, there are steps that a Trump Justice Department can take now that make that impossible for future departments of justice. And I expect that they'll exercise those. These are folks who have told us what they want to do at the Department of Justice, and we would be wise to take them seriously. I think there will be some repercussions for folks who were involved in the prosecution of these cases. That doesn't mean I necessarily think that they themselves will be prosecuted, but you can make people's lives extraordinarily difficult and tortured even without prosecuting them. You can refer them to discipline at bar committees. You can refer them for internal investigation in the Department of Justice. You can sue them civilly. You can force them to testify before Congress. There are any number of ways that these people will have to relive the decisions that they made during these prosecutions, and we should trust that that is going to happen. And on top of that, some of these people may lose their jobs and or be reassigned. Now, is it lawful for them to lose their jobs? Not necessarily. In fact, there are lots of civil service protections that would suggest that those who are career staff shouldn't be able to lose their jobs. But do I expect that some of them will be fired and will have to force through litigation reinstatement of their jobs? Yes, and that's an expense too, both psychologically and literally.